Self-development is supposed to be about evolving, healing, and becoming your best self. But if you're queer or neurodivergent, you've probably realized that those spaces don't feel like they were built for you. Instead of feeling empowered and inspired, you probably just feel like you're trying to squeeze yourself into a mold that was never made with you in mind. You probably hear advice like wake up at 5 a.m., stick to a strict routine, stay disciplined no matter what. Just push through your lack of motivation. It's all in your mindset. Or step into your feminine energy so you can attract a strong masculine man. And if you don't fit into those frameworks, you're left feeling like something's wrong with you, like self development wasn't made for people like us. I remember when I first got into self development, I was so excited to glow up physically, mentally, emotionally. I was watching all the videos, listening to all the podcasts, just trying to follow every piece of advice. But the more I listened, the more I started to feel like I didn't belong. I wasn't a wake up at 5 a.m. and grind type of person. I struggled with executive dysfunction. I was someone who wanted to step into my feminine energy, but certainly not to attract a man. And no matter how much I tried to force myself into these self development frameworks, they just didn't fit me. And that left me wondering, am I the problem? Am I just not disciplined enough to grow? But here's what I learned, it's not that you're failing at self development, it's that self development spaces weren't made with you in mind. So if you've ever felt like you just don't belong in self development spaces, if you ever felt like the advice didn't work for you, you're not alone. So today we're talking about how self-development spaces can be so isolating when you're queer, neurodivergent, or both, because self-development isn't about forcing yourself into someone else's framework, it's about creating one that aligns with you. A lot of mainstream self-development advice is built around structure, discipline, and consistency. And while that works for some people, when you're neurodivergent, that type of rigidity can feel impossible to maintain. What's frustrating is that these spaces rarely acknowledge that different brains work differently. Instead, they push a one-size-fits-all approach, leaving so many people feeling like they're failing. Not because they're not trying hard enough, but because the system they're trying to follow wasn't designed for them in the first place. In self-development spaces, productivity is treated like the ultimate measure of success. You hear things like successful people wake up at 5 a.m., meditate, and hit the gym all before 7 a.m. Or just be disciplined. You either want it or you don't. And that's great advice if your brain actually works that way. But what happens when your brain doesn't work that way? When you physically can't force yourself into those rigid routines? When just be more disciplined feels like an uphill battle every single day. So why doesn't this work for neurodiverse people? If your brain struggles with prioritization, time blindness, or task initiation, then waking up at 5 a.m. and following a 12-step morning routine isn't just difficult, it's nearly impossible. And it's not because you're lazy, it's because your brain processes tasks differently. A lot of neurodiverse people thrive in flexibility, not structure. Rigid rules often create more resistance than motivation. A morning routine shouldn't feel like a prison. It should be a set of options that work with your natural rhythms. Neurodivergent people don't just struggle with motivation, they struggle with regulation. When your nervous system is constantly exhausted or overstimulated, pushing through isn't always an option, as it can lead to complete shutdown. If you have ADHD, autism, or any other type of neurodivergence, you might find yourself thinking, why can't I just be consistent? But here's what I need you to understand. Your brain isn't broken. The system you're trying to follow just isn't designed for how your brain works. So instead of blaming yourself for struggling, build self-development habits that actually work with your brain. If strict routines don't work for you, try task batching. If long to-do lists overwhelm you, break your tasks into micro steps. If motivation is inconsistent, create a system where momentum, not willpower, carries you through. You don't need to fix yourself to be successful. You just need to stop forcing yourself into neurotypical self-development systems that were never designed for you. Another problem with self-development spaces? Their obsession with hustle culture. You've probably heard things like successful people work 16-hour days, so what's your excuse? Or when you're sleeping, someone's outworking you. Or the worst one for me is if you're not constantly improving, you're just being lazy. This mindset is toxic for everyone, but if you're neurodivergent, it's 10 times worse. Because when we try and push ourselves into hustle culture without considering first how our brains work, we don't just get tired, we burn out. Neurodivergent people experience energy differently. Some days you might feel like you can conquer the world. Other days, even the most basic tasks seem impossible. This isn't because you're lazy, it's because your energy fluctuates based on dopamine regulation, sensory input, and burnout cycles. When a neurodivergent brain gets overwhelmed, it doesn't always push through. It shuts down. Hustle culture assumes that just work harder is even an option, but for people with executive dysfunction, just starting can be the hardest part. Neurodivergent people spend so much energy trying to act neurotypical just to function in the world. That means we often experience burnout a lot faster than neurotypical people. And yet hustle culture tells us we're not doing enough when we're actually working harder than most people just to exist in a system that wasn't designed for us. So how do you actually grow without burning out? If traditional schedules don't work, design a workflow that does. Work during peak energy time, and set deadlines creatively, like I'll finish this before lunch, instead of setting a strict time. If you hyperfocus, lean into it. Batch similar tasks together and ride the wave when it comes. But also, recognize when your brain and body needs rest, because burnout doesn't serve your goals. Self-improvement isn't just about doing more. Sometimes it's about giving yourself permission to recharge without guilt. You cannot become your best self if you're constantly running on an empty tank. Instead of pushing yourself to exhaustion, ask yourself, what's the smartest way for me to get this done? Efficiency is way more powerful than working yourself into the ground. The truth is, you don't need to grind 24/7 in order to become your best self. You just need to build habits that actually work for you. And if you've spent your whole life thinking you're bad at discipline or you're just not motivated enough, I need you to hear this. You are not the problem. The system was the problem. And now, it's time to create a new one. Something I've noticed in the self-development space is that the way they talk about romance, relationships, and becoming your best self often assumes you're straight. The language around love, attraction, and even personal growth is centered around this idea that you're a woman who wants to be more in her feminine energy in order to attract a strong and masculine man. And listen, there is nothing wrong with wanting that. If that advice resonates with you, that's great. But what happens if you don't fit that mold? What if you're queer? What if you're non-binary? What if stepping into your feminine energy just doesn't align with you? A lot of self-development advice assumes that success, happiness, and personal fulfillment revolves around a romantic relationship, specifically with a man. And not just any man, a high-value man. You hear things like, feminine women attract strong, masculine men. Or, a high-value woman lets the man take the lead. Or, you need to be more in your feminine so you can attract the right masculine provider. And if you're queer, a masculine-presenting woman or non-binary, that advice just doesn't apply. So it leaves you wondering, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to become my best self if the framework doesn't fit my identity? The entire structure of advice assumes that your highest form of self-worth is being chosen by a man, that your glow up is incomplete unless you're in a romantic relationship with a masculine partner. And for queer people, that's not only irrelevant, it can feel like erasure. So why is this so isolating for queer people? If you don't want a man, a lot of this advice becomes completely irrelevant. If you're masculine presenting or non-binary, the whole feminine energy discussion might feel like it wasn't made for you. Even if you're in a queer relationship, you rarely hear advice that's actually designed for queer people. And romance is often talked about as if it's the end goal. Like your self-development journey isn't complete unless it ends in a romantic relationship. But self-development should be about becoming your best self for you, not to fit into a heteronormative idea of what a high-value woman looks like. Not to mold yourself into the perfect partner for someone else, but because you deserve to feel confident, fulfilled, and empowered on your own terms. One of the biggest buzzwords in the self-development space is feminine energy. There are entire books, podcasts, and videos dedicated to the idea that women are happiest when they embrace their femininity, when they become soft, nurturing, and receptive, and let go of their masculine traits. And listen, for some people, that advice really resonates. If embracing femininity feels empowering to you, that's great. But what about the people it doesn't align with? What if you're a masculine presenting woman who doesn't want to step into her soft energy? What if you're non-binary and don't feel connected to masculine or feminine energy at all? And what if the whole conversation about attracting a masculine provider makes you feel like you don't belong in this space at all? Why this doesn't work for everyone? Some people feel powerful in their femininity. Others feel powerful in their androgyny, their masculinity, or a bit of both. Not every queer person wants to attract a masculine man. Some of us don't want men at all. If you've ever tried to take in self-development content but always felt like you never fully fit into the conversation, this is why. The conversation isn't built for people outside of a rigid gender binary. So what do you do if all of this self-development advice doesn't actually align with your identity? How do you build confidence, self-worth, and success if the mainstream narratives don't fit? Instead of asking, how can I more be in my feminine energy, ask yourself, what energy makes me feel more empowered, more confident, more myself? Maybe for you it's a mix of strength and softness. Maybe it's embracing your boldness, your directness, your assertiveness. Or maybe it's embracing an energy that is entirely unique to you. You don't have to force yourself into a mold that doesn't align with your identity. If the advice is making you feel like you need to change yourself just to be worthy, it's not for you. Find self-development content that actually acknowledges different gender expressions, sexualities, or relationship dynamics. Confidence isn't about being more feminine. It's about showing up as your authentic self. Presence isn't about being more soft or more delicate. It's about owning your space. And success isn't about whether you can attract a man. It's about how aligned and fulfilled in your life you feel. Because self-development should be about becoming the most authentic, empowered version of yourself. Not about trying to fit into someone else's version of what high value or magnetic looks like. So let's go over it again. How do you build a self-development journey that actually works for you? 1. Create a system that works for your brain. 2. Find self-development voices that include you. 3. Stop trying to fit into spaces that weren't built for you. You are not failing because you don't fit into mainstream self development spaces. Those spaces were never designed with you in mind. So instead of trying to shrink yourself to fit in those spaces, create a version of self growth that actually empowers you. At the end of the day, self development should make you feel empowered, not erased. You don't need to change who you are to be worthy of growth, and you don't need to subscribe to a version of self-development that was never built with you in mind. That's it for today. If this video spoke to you, leave a comment and tell me what's one piece of mainstream advice that never applied to you. And if you're ready to start your self-development journey in a way that actually works for you, stick around, because this is just the beginning.